I'm not actually sure what. I think it was probably come from super skunk, which is a type of weed, like a very quite potent weed that floated around in Corby now and again, and we'd partaken in quite a lot of. And a scud was like it's like this slang for a scud mag, like a porno mag. Just a silly title, really, which didn't really mean anything. Like I say, none of the titles had anything to do with the lyrics because there weren't any most of the time. But I think we were thinking we probably couldn't get away with calling it Super Skunk, so it became Super Scud for some stupid reason. And I think that was one of the later songs we recorded. It was on the second demo, and because I remember by that point we were rehearsing quite a lot at the local community centre in Corby, which we could practice for free on Tuesdays, and that was the place I'd first met Frank and stuff playing other bands. He was like this little Jimi Hendrix guitar genius with this quite big hair. Like, who's that kid? I remember being thinking it was fitting to have another song which was a bit catchier and shorter before we were done with writing it, because we'd written quite a lot of longer, slower songs, and it was good to get one of them in, and yeah, it ended up becoming the first song on the record. The name of that song comes from the War of the Worlds by Orson Welles, and the soundtrack to that. My memory of Redweed is that we were all working in a factory at the time. Like Gordon's dad, Moggy, was like some sort of supervisor at this factory. It was like an iron gate factory or something like that, where they sprayed iron gates with this material that weatherproofed it. And between like gigs, if we had like a week or two free back home and we had no money, then Gordon had arranged that we could all like work in Moggy's factory. And so we were like in space, kind of working there, just like packing these iron gates in these cardboard boxes or something. One thing I remember is that Gordon never seemed to do any work. He was like just walking around with a cup of tea the whole time while the rest of us actually worked and shouting instructions at us. And obviously, like, living off the fact that his dad, he kind of claimed some sort of fucking status in that factory because his dad worked there while the rest of us were just slaving away. It was an exciting time because we were writing more and more songs, and we were listening to that musical soundtrack of War of the Worlds for some reason. It was something that had captured our imagination at the time. And there was this, and Redweed was this like plant or something in that, and there was this riff that was on one of the songs in the soundtrack that had the end riff to Redweed. I remember just like working opposite Tony, we were packing these boxes, and we decided there and then we would just rip that riff off to the note. just completely take it, and and we incorporated that into the end of that song, and it was a really cool riff, I thought, and still one of my favourite riffs on the record. And we were like, can we just take it straight off? Can we just of course we can. Who the fuck's ever going to hear this record? Knives and Faces was like, for me, kind of our Corby anthem kind of thing. It was, I think maybe Frank came up with the title for that, and it was, it was like a kind of, it was probably one of the few titles which we did have a bit of thought. It kind of was consciously connected to Corby and the violence that went on there. There was a lot of knives and shit and pretty ugly violence going on in the town. I think not long before there'd been quite a big incident where two of these like leading gangster families in Corby there'd been some sort of revenge, fucking hatchet job on one of the guys from that family. Had been like beaten up with like baseball bats with razors in them in like outside this bar on a Friday night, and it was like, fuck me. And that was all happening around the time we were writing this. The family was called the Gillespies or something. They were like renowned, and one of the Gillespies had been done with this horrific weapon. I think Darren wrote like the second part, that big doomy riff, and it was like me and Tony wrote most of the riffs, but when Darren wrote riffs, now and again they were like, he came with some real bangers, and that was one of them. That's and I really loved the fact that Bloody Kev, who's now one of my absolute best friends, sang guest vocals on that. And I remember when we not long after releasing the record, we played in London and got Kev to come up and do guest vocals live, and he couldn't remember the lyrics and had like he sang quite a lot of lyrics on that. He sings like the whole second part, and he had the lyrics like written on this like little post-it note. And I remember thinking, how the fuck has he got all the lyrics on there? And then he just like looked at them and then just threw it away and started singing. But yeah, that's one of my favourites on the record, and it was like the opening song to our live gigs for a long time. The name of that song comes from, and this is a little bit of a theme because it was the name of one of our best friend's dogs. We had this couple of brothers, the American George and his brother Stephen, and they lived in one of like the roughest housing estates together with Roddy, who drove us on tour. They both lived up this really rough housing estate, which half of it was like boarded up and closed down, and they lived up there, and we hung out there a lot because you could, sit and smoke weed and nobody would like bother you up there. And they had this pit bull dog called Mandan. I think Mandan was the name of the town where they come from in North Dakota or South Dakota. I can't remember which Dakota it was, but it was the name of the town they were from anyway. And yeah, it was like a bit of a rockier song. Random Acts of Violence, again, kind of related to Corby, but also related to a bit of a theme which I had in sort of stealing songs, title ideas, or from places. And I think it was that the band Fudge Tunnel, which was one of my favourite bands at the time as well, from Nottingham, had released a record with a song called Random Acts of Cruelty, and I was like, yeah, we should kind of half steal that. The fun thing with that was that Gordon had found this drum kit on the Classifieds in Nottingham, this blue kit, and it was this beautiful like blue Premier drum kit. It was really nice, sort of baby blue colour and kind of really unique. And when I went to pick it up, it was actually Adrian, the drummer from Fudge Tunnel. It's like when Gordon told me that, I was like blown away by it, and I really wish I'd followed him and got to meet him. I was like, so for a long time I was like, fuck, we had the Fudge Tunnel drum kit, and for a long time I think Gordon still has that drum kit. Yeah, one of my favourites. Well, I think we also opened up with that a few times, like that really long sludgy first part of the song, and then goes into that kind of jumpy bit. And I think that was maybe the first or second song on the second demo, maybe. Oh, it was definitely on the second demo anyway. And, yeah. Thumper, another dog song, and also another stealing song. Frank and his dad, Big Stan, they ran this like a car kind of a scrapyard place. They picked up cars, like recovery, and they worked on cars. And for a long time we practiced there in like a static caravan, which was really small. We rehearsed down there. It was insane. It was like tiny, and we had full stacks in there rehearsing, and it's probably a big part of the explanation to the tinnitus I have today. And they had this guard dog, this Alsatian German Shepherd called Thumper, and who we all kind of loved. And I think Thumper was even in one of the early photo shoots we did in Corby, and I had Thumper the dog with us. So I was like, yeah, we have to call our song Thumper. And it was also title of a song by Jesus Lizard, who's another favourite band of mine, and so I was like, yeah, we can rip off Jesus Lizard and name another song after a dog. And that was another one of the few riffs that Darren wrote which were like absolute gold. Like I think he wrote 2 or 3, but whereas me and Tony would just like blow them out like a production line. With Darren maybe thought a little bit more about the riffs he wrote, and he wrote the main riff to that. Wasn't at all expected that would be any kind of hit, but the label picked up on it, and we actually recorded like another version of that first, and it was whether it was going to be like some sort of demo, we weren't sure, but we were going to go down to London and record, and then it was going to be on like some Metal Hammer CD, and we ended up recording it with this really nice guy called Mark Heel, who played in this industrial band called Cubinate, together with our friend Dave, who managed us. And Dave had the idea of having Mark record us, which wasn't a great match for me personally as far as music goes. I like Mark as a person, but he was like, experimenting with all these like Sherman kind of oscillating filters and whatever they're called. It's like give it this really industrial kind of filter on the drums, and it was like, oh god, fucking horrible. That version ended up getting released on the Metal Hammer CD, and people seemed to pick up on it, which kind of was a little bit, well, very disappointing for us, because it felt to us like that's not at all how we sound, and fucking typical if everyone likes this version of a song. It's the first thing we release and it sounds nothing like us, everyone likes it, we're fucked. We were very aware that we had to get more, like do a new version of that song on the album as well. And the demo version of that song is about half the speed of the song that came on the album. Which is another thing, you know, like we had an idea that the album was going to be this sludgy sludge fest and slower and long songs, and someone at the label was like, but that's a hit and it has to be fast, you know, it's like you need to, and we were insisted it would be a slower version like the demo was. And then when the album was like mixed and done, we were like, but that song's Thumper's faster, it's like something strange, it sounds faster. And the label were trying to, like, you know, gaslight, like, no, that's not, it's the version you recorded. And I think this is like, you know, the first time where we kind of maybe did get a bit of credit for having our head on our shoulders, because we'd always been these like dumb kids who just like to get drunk and had this perception of us that we didn't really take too much seriously, but we always took the music seriously. And a few of us in the band were like, they understood music as well, believe it or not. And Frank was one of them, and we got this argument with the label saying that it's faster, and like saying it's not fast, it's the same version, blah blah blah. And Frank said, well, we can confirm that by just getting a guitar, playing along to it and seeing if it's in the right tuning, and if it's not in the right tuning, then you've obviously speeded up the version. And then the label was like, okay. We speeded it up. So, but yeah, it still ended up being that version of the song, and people liked it, but more than we did. Yeah. Well, glue sniffing was obviously a bit of a theme in Corby, because glue sniffing was like the drug of choice from a lot of, you know, addicts and stuff in Corby, because it was cheap. The woodland areas where we had around Corby, you'd often see like glue sniffers walking around. It was like fucking like a zombie film, you know. Like, I'm not saying they were played, but you'd if you walked around in the woods long enough, you'd definitely see the odd glue sniffer here and there with a plastic bag. And so glue sniffing was obviously part of our background as well. Nothing that we ever actually did ourselves, but that's where like the sniff glue worship Satan thing came on the shirts as well. It was a thing of, you know, just trying to, you know, just coming up with like deliberately shock titles for things, and that was one of them, just like sniff glue worship Satan was. I think we also had like ideas around having a logo on or a slogan on our shirts about kill your school teachers or kill your parents and daft shit like that, but that one stuck. And yeah, Necrophiliac was one of those, and I think one of the more Iron Monkey inspired riffs, as far as, you know, when the Iron Monkey second record came out and that was a bit more up tempo as well, that was like a nod to that, I think. Yeah, I wonder if that wasn't like Frank doing some kind of skit with vocals or something, because we'd had on the demos we'd released this track called like Hit Single, which was like a piss take of the record industry and having a hit single, because they were pushing us for this like whole thumper thing and that. And the hit single was just like a noise track. It was just Frank like manically ranting on down a mic with like, and with loads of distortion on it. And maybe it was something along, I think it might have been taken from that, or Frank did a similar thing just quickly in the studio for that. Dungeon Whippet. Talk about taking just titles from your environment. I don't know what the story is behind it, but we were like hanging out with we had some friends in the next town, in a town called Wellingborough, because they had like a nightclub there with like an alternative night at this nightclub. So we were hanging there a bit, and part of that crowd there was this like girl who was like a bit shorter and part of the alternative scene, and I didn't really know her that well, but I remember being like presented to her as like everyone called her Dungeon Whippet, which is like fucking harsh as fuck. And I don't know why, but that was like what they called her. And that was like, well, that's a fucking great song title, obviously. So. And one of my favourites on the record that was like really fun to play live, and a bit more of like a nod to the punkier side of our background as well. And yeah, I had no idea that it glitched on Spotify, which tells you how much I listen to the record on Spotify, I guess. But no, I had no idea. It's quite a fucking glitch. It's harsh. Death Row Dogs, I remember we were sat one day, like I said, at George and Stephen's place, the American guys up in the RMY estate in their flat, just with nothing to do, in the middle of the day, fucking curtains drawn and blocking the sun out, and just watching just crap American TV and docu-soap stuff and documentary stuff. And there was a documentary about unwanted dogs in the States, and they were, waiting to be either find a home or be put down and referred to as Death Row Dogs, and that's where that title came from. And I think also maybe one of the earlier songs, I think we played Death Row Dogs. I think we played that at the first show in Corby, that first show at The Rock. It was definitely on the first demo, and that song, if not the first, it was maybe the second song we ever wrote. And when we wrote that song, my idea then was that that's how the entire sound would sound. I wanted to do nothing but slow songs like that. And I think we might have opened with that song at the very first gig, which was also tied into the idea of trying to scare the crowd away from us and playing like a 10-minute version of that or something. And I think that was maybe one of the only times we opened with that. And that was also part of my idea of opening with that when we did the 20th anniversary show in 2018, was opening with that song. High Whore, yeah, Christ almighty. I mean, talk about song titles you would never dream of calling a song when you're 47 years old and it's fucking 2025. It was just a spin on an expression like high horse, get off your high horse, you think you're better than us, and probably some dig at someone we knew in Corby or something. Not a very maybe politically correct or acceptable title today, and nothing I would call a song today, but yeah, it comes from that. And that was for a long time, like, we always ended with that song because I had that huge riff. Probably one of my favourite riffs I ever wrote for the band was the last riff in that song, and sometimes we would play that riff, end the set on that, and just that riff alone would go like 10 minutes, along till everything collapsed. And yeah, one of those songs we played live pretty much the entire of our career. There's no song which I don't think should have a, that's out of place there. I like them all, When we recorded that record, it was the 10 songs we had pretty much. We'd had one other song which we'd scrapped before. That was on the first demo, a song called Down. And I think even a riff from that song appeared on another. It appeared on a song on the second album, I think. We did quite a lot of that as well. We kind of recycled stuff that if we scrapped it. So those 10 songs that appeared on the record there, I'm going to say the 10 because the Gush that came after. They, I think they pressed it again with a Gush later on or something. That for me wasn't part of that record. Well, The Gush was, supposed to be a song for the second record. We were writing between touring. We were spending most of our time down Frank and Stan's car yard, rehearsing in that caravan. I think we wrote big chunks of that second record in the caravan there. And I remember clearly writing The Gush. And Darren, that's another one of his riffs, he came up with that bass intro and that whole kind of spine of the song. I think it was maybe the third song we wrote for the second record. And I was thinking, fuck, this second record's going to be good. We're actually starting to take a bit more interest in writing songs then. Then the label had got us a slot opening for the Ozfest at the Milton Keynes Bowl, which was going to be an insanely big show. I think it's without doubt the biggest show I've ever played, maybe 45,000 people, 50,000 people or something. Because we were playing that, the label wanted to put out a single between the two albums, and because our second record wasn't going to be ready in time for that, and they wanted something else, of course something new to sell to coincide with this show. And I was always like really precious about these things. I was like, no, that song's for the second record. It's going to be like the third track on the second record. Because I'm always, also when we're writing songs, I'm always even imagining them when they're going to be placed on the album. And I remember clearly thinking The Gush was song 3 on the second record. And to have that as a single, it would like kind of, And then we recorded it. And because it was going to be a single, I think the label really wanted to put a commercial kind of tone on the thing, like the fucking video, which was a disgrace. And then the mixing of it all, and it sounded like, as much as I despised being like labeled in with new metal and stuff, that was one song, that version of it that was recorded, where we could have rightly been kind of labeled as new metal, because we had recorded and I was kind of semi-okay with how the music sounded, and then we'd recorded vocals on it, and then the label weren't happy with the vocals because it was too screamy, too shouty, and they wanted to have a more defined, clearer vocal on it. So they ended up taking Frank down to the studio in London on his own, paid for his train down and stuff, and the rest of us didn't get to go down. And then they came back with that kind of really clean and almost rappy verse he did on it. And I remember when we heard that, and the label loved it. They were like, this is fantastic, this is going to be great. Whilst me and Gordon were sat down the yard at the practice space, almost in tears, and Gordon saying to me, Gaz, do you think this is the end of the band? This is the band's over, kind of thing. It's like, what the fuck are all our friends going to say? What are all the other bands that we want to go out and tour with, the bands that we respect? Nobody's ever going to respect us again from that scene that we care about. So you couldn't have had a bigger contrast between how we felt about it and how the label felt about it. And Frank was I think Frank felt embarrassed by it as well. It was, it sucked really. But I always liked the song, and it was always fun to play live. And of course, when we played it live, it was the screamy version. Frank screamed over the verses, and so it was still a live favourite for a long time, And in my mind, that still is, to me, it belongs to the second record, but became something else. And valuable lesson learned. But then it did sell a lot, which is of course what the label wanted. We didn't care so much about that, but the label were happy, so. I don't really remember, because I've probably watched it once or twice since it came out. But I remember that there was a nighttime and a daytime version. I'm pretty sure that the nighttime version probably had more nudity and probably a bit more violence in it, kind of thing. And yeah, I'm sure basically there was some naked breasts in the fucking nighttime version, which were edited out for the daytime version. God. When we recorded that video, I was just thinking, what the fuck are we doing? But yeah, can you do?